I don't drag this story out of my chest unless someone pushes me hard enough. Maybe you're the kind of friend who'll regret asking. Or maybe you're the kind that needs to know. Either way, you wanted the truth, so I'm handing it over, piece by piece. By the end, you might not look at me the same way, but you asked for honesty, and I'm done sugarcoating any of it. I've tried to forget those months spent lurching between half-dead subway cars and the stale overhead lights. The memory of cheap coffee and roach-infested bodega tiles still clings to my senses. That time in my life felt like diving headlong into a sewer and living there until I got used to the smell. You might say every New Yorker carries a piece of the city's grit under their nails, but I had entire chunks of it lodged under my skin, right down to the marrow. What follows is my recollection, how I dropped out of college, juggled two shitty, part-time jobs, and ended up crossing paths with a man who turned my nights into a horror show. It starts mundane, almost boring, and then slides into something you might think belongs in a late-night slasher flick. Yet I swear on the last bit of decency in my bones, all of it happened. I was 22, maybe going on 23, when I said fuck this to the mountain of student loans looming over me. I walked out of my second year at a community college in Queens, right after flunking a biology exam I couldn't be bothered to study for. My heart wasn't in it. I was living in a cramped studio with a roommate who was basically a ghost. She'd vanish for days, show up to grab some clothes, then breeze out again. I envied her freedom until I realized I was also stuck in my own pattern. Working shitty jobs, slipping deeper into debt, and ignoring my father's phone calls telling me to be responsible. I wish I could blame the city for everything, but that's a cop-out. The city doesn't give a damn if you live, or die. It just keeps pumping hot trash-scented air in your face, forcing you forward whether you like it or not. Maybe that's what I loved and hated about it. During daylight, I manned the counter at a bodega on 31st Street. The place was called Manny's, though Manny had been dead for years, and his nephew, some prick named Jorge, ran the place with zero regard for labor laws. He'd cut corners on our shifts and pay us under the table with no health benefits. I couldn't complain much because I needed it. Another job cleaning offices came right after. I'd shuffle out of Manny's around 5 in the afternoon, scarf down something resembling food, then hustle to a cleaning service that sent me to random corporate buildings all over Manhattan. We'd wipe desks, vacuum carpets, empty trash bins. Real soul-sucking stuff, but at least it put a few crumpled bills in my wallet. All that work meant I was constantly on the subway. If you haven't ridden the E train at midnight, you might imagine it's a typical commute. But the later it gets, the more the train transforms into a sort of purgatory. Lights flicker, a wave of stale body heat envelops you, and nobody's face looks friendly. That's where I first noticed him. That nondescript middle-aged guy who kept to himself, wearing a dark jacket and reading some paperback with a cracked spine. I used to glance across the aisle, see his thinning hair combed neatly, and think nothing of it. Because that's what you do in the city. You don't stare too long, you mind your own business, you keep to yourself. I'd see him sometimes in the morning too, if I got off my cleaning shift early enough and took the train again. You start recognizing the same people on your route. The homeless guy who sleeps with his hood pulled over his face, the teenage girl with her art portfolio, the nurse in scrubs who nods off on the seat. So sure, he was just part of the daily background. Nothing special. But then, little details started stacking up that made my nerves prick. My routine felt like a hamster wheel. I'd drag my ass into Manny's at the crack of dawn, because that's when I had to open up the store, and stand behind the counter while bleary-eyed locals grabbed coffee, bagels, smokes, whatever. I'd let them shuffle in and out, do the register, restock shelves. Jorge's idea of a break was letting me stand near the entrance for 10 minutes. Big fucking whoop. Around mid-afternoon, I'd close out, do a quick handoff to the next cashier, maybe munch on half a slice of leftover pizza from the display if I was lucky. Then I'd jet over to the cleaning service. They'd assign me to some office in Midtown. I'd push a mop around, empty trash cans that reeked of old Chinese takeout, and mentally curse out every office worker who left their personal mess for me to deal with. The shift would wrap up past midnight on a good day, maybe closer to 1 if my coworker for the night was slow. I'm not gonna lie, I was exhausted. My back ached constantly. My feet felt broken by the time I got to the platform for that final commute home. My reflection in the subway window looked like a ghost. Dark circles under the eyes, greasy hair pulled back into a ragged ponytail, uniform smelling like bleach and sweat. That night, let's say it was mid-October, the air had that cold snap. My phone buzzed with another missed call from my dad. I didn't want to hear his lecture, so I shoved the phone deeper into my hoodie pocket. The train screeched into the station. Dim lights flickered inside. The conductor's voice crackled over the speaker, unintelligible. Doors slid open, and the stale stink of the subway practically slapped me in the face. I grabbed a seat next to the door, grateful to park my aching feet. Then he appeared. He stepped onto the train with a calm, almost mechanical gait, holding his paperback. Eyes flicked across the faces of the passengers before landing on me. He offered a small nod, as though we were acquaintances, and took a seat across the aisle. Might have been a courtesy gesture, or something else. I chalked it up to us both being regulars. He read, or pretended to read, while I watched the blackness zip by outside the window. The train rattled on, carrying us through the labyrinth of the city. At the next stop, a wave of tired workers shuffled on and off. A woman clutched a couple of plastic grocery bags. A dude in a puffer jacket held an unlit cigarette. The door hissed shut, and we kept going. There was nothing dramatic about it, just a moment where his gaze lifted from the page, and I realized he was staring right at me. Not the idle glance you give a random commuter, but an unblinking look that lingered a second too long. My gut tensed, but I shrugged it off. Maybe he was zoning out. Maybe he recognized me from previous nights and thought, "Oh, it's that girl who always looks half dead." When I got off at my stop, he stayed on. I watched him vanish into the tunnel. That was it. I went home, kicked off my sneakers, crashed. On the thin mattress, I called a bed. I slept like a corpse and forgot about him until the next day. My second job ended earlier than usual one evening. I'd called Manny's to see if they needed help, but the new girl was covering, so I found myself with a rare chunk of free time. Strange how an extra hour can feel like a different dimension when you're used to every minute feeling claimed. I decided to hang around the bodega anyway. Maybe chat with the new girl, Sasha or Sandra. I couldn't remember. My presence might annoy Jorge, but I figured he could deal with it. The place was lit up by those harsh fluorescent lights that give everything a sickly, yellowed tint. You could see dust in the air if you looked closely. "Yo, Rita!" Jorge barked from behind a stack of boxes. "You here to pick up more hours, or something?" I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "I'm here for moral support," I joked, though my voice sounded ragged from the day's labor. "Heard you might actually need it." He rolled his eyes. "Not paying for moral support, so don't expect anything." I let that nonsense slide. The new cashier fiddled with the register, eyes darting nervously. She was a slip of a person, likely younger than me, who flinched whenever Jorge raised his voice. I felt a pang of sympathy, but also relief that I wasn't the new fish anymore. I wandered through the aisles, checking shelves out of habit. Once you work in a place like that, you can't stop noticing crooked labels and expired items. Eventually, I circled back to the front, where the cooler of drinks hummed in the background. Right about then, the door chimed. I glanced over, expecting a local. It was him, the subway guy. His jacket was the same dark shade, hair neatly combed, and he still carried a paperback in one hand. A slight lift of the corners of his mouth could have been interpreted as a smile, or a smirk. Hard to say. He walked down the aisle, scanning the shelves, his footsteps eerily quiet. I felt a chill. Because in Manhattan, you can see the same person on the train every day and think nothing of it. But having that same person show up in your workplace, that raises a flag. My rational side insisted it was a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby. People do that. They pop into bodegas for a soda or a quick snack. But my heart hammered in my chest. I tried to look unbothered. He moved with a deliberate slowness, like he was soaking up every detail, every corner. He reached the back of the store, studied the freezers, then walked to the counter. "Pack of gum," he said, voice low and calm. "And a small coffee." Sasha fumbled with the register. "Sure, that'll be, $3.50. He slid exact change across the counter. No hesitation. 1 dime, 1 nickel, 1 quarter, $1 bill, like he'd prepared in advance. Then he shifted his gaze toward me, tilting his head as though trying to place me. "Don't you ride the E-train?" he asked. My stomach coiled. Sometimes. Late shifts. I forced a shrug. "City's big, though." "Yes, it is," he said, a faint trace of amusement in his eyes. Then he sipped the coffee. Didn't flinch at how scalding it must have been. The same small, polite nod followed, and he turned toward the door. I watched him leave, the bell chiming softly. He melted into the busy street. As soon as he was gone, it felt like the fluorescent glare sharpened, showing me just how tired I was. I turned to Sasha, who gave me a questioning look. "You know that guy?" she asked. "Nope," I lied or half-lied. Because in the city, do you really ever know anyone? Life continued in that grinding, punishing cycle. Days blurred. My phone was a constant reminder that I owed the world money. Dad kept calling. Debt collectors spammed me with threats. The only glimmer of relief was that my roommate was gone, most of the time, so I had our dusty little space to myself. One night, I was cleaning offices in a towering building with mirrored windows that reflected the city skyline. It was the kind of place where CEOs probably snorted coke off mahogany desks. My coworker, Anisha, was in another room, vacuuming. I was alone in a conference room, wiping down chairs and trying not to nod off. That's when the overhead light flickered, casting shadows that danced on the pristine carpet. I paused, the rag in hand, a sudden sense of being watched crawling up my spine. Nobody was there. Just me, the gleaming conference table, and the smell of industrial cleaner. Still, I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, expecting to see that man with the paperback. It was absurd. There was no reason for him to show up. There. Yet the fear gnawed at the back of my mind. By the time I finished, Anisha was nowhere to be seen. I found her in a supply closet rummaging through extra rolls of trash bags. She gave me a weird look when I mentioned my paranoia. "Girl, you've been working too hard," she said, shaking her head. "Take a breath." She was right. I needed sleep or a vacation, or maybe a stiff drink. But none of those options were in my budget. We finished around midnight. I stumbled to the elevator, parted ways with Anisha in the lobby, and stepped onto the street. The sky loomed above, a dull orange-brown haze of light pollution, smothering any real stars. Traffic was still thick, honking cabs and bus brakes squealing. Another day, another shift done. Down into the subway I went, that stale, subterranean corridor lined with flickering lights and chipped tiles. A rat scurried along the tracks, tail snaking behind it. I joined the small gaggle of passengers waiting on the platform. A woman in a patched jacket, a drunk who reeked of cheap whiskey, a couple of tired souls who looked like me. We all wore the same haunted glaze over our eyes. The train arrived, headlights carving a path through the tunnel's darkness. Doors hissed open, and I slumped into a seat near the middle of the car. The overhead lighting had that distinct hospital vibe, making everyone look sallow. Nobody looked at each other. Eye contact is city taboo. When we lurched forward, I spotted him at the far end of the car, He was leaning against a pole, reading his paperback. Same jacket, same blank expression. He didn't look up, but I felt targeted, pinned under an invisible gaze. I told myself it was all in my head. Coincidences happen. 3 stops later, I risked a sideways glance. He had relocated to the next pole, a few seats closer. Maybe someone else took his spot, or maybe the crowd shifted him. My pulse ratcheted, up anyway. I hated how paranoid I felt, like a skittish animal. But that's the thing about living in a city where you're told to trust no one. You start suspecting everyone of something. A few days passed, and I tried to bury that creeping paranoia by doubling down on routine. Work, commute, home, rinse and repeat. But little details kept piling up, like roaches in a filthy corner. One afternoon, Manny's was slow. I was reading People magazine, some year-old issue someone left behind when the door opened. Expecting a typical customer, I looked up and froze. It was him again, drifting inside like a shadow. He moved to the coolers in the back, grabbed a bottle of water, and made his way to the counter. This time, the new girl wasn't around. So, it was just me, blinking behind the register. He set the water down. $1.50, I murmured, feeling my throat constrict. My mind screamed that I was being irrational, but a twinge of fear tightened my shoulders. He fished out exact change. Again, no words, just a calm stare. Then he said, "Rita, right?" My breath hitched. I'd never given him my name. I forced a laugh to cover the tremor in my voice. "Yeah. Do I know you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just smirked, like he enjoyed watching me squirm, and walked out, water in hand. The door beeped behind him. My heart hammered. If Manny were alive and behind that counter, he might have told me to snap out of it and keep working. But Manny was dead, and I was alone. I spent the rest of the shift, trembling, cursing under my breath whenever a customer asked for help. Eventually, I shot a text to my friend Katie, one of the few people I trusted. "Dude's been creeping around. Knows my name. Don't ask me how." She didn't respond right away, probably because she worked a night shift. But the act of texting, her eased some of my anxiety. At least I wasn't holding it in alone. That night, I got stuck late at the cleaning job again. Another subway ride. Another wave of dread. Yet I didn't see him, which made me question whether I had overreacted. I tried to imagine logical explanations. Maybe he overheard a coworker call me by name. Or he saw my name tag, though I rarely wore it. The city is full of ways to glean someone's identity. Data leaks, random gossip, you name it. Still, it felt personal. Too precise. The next day, Katie finally replied to my text, telling me to be careful, that men can be freaking psycho. That's Katie for you, direct and usually right. She also suggested I keep a small can of pepper spray on me. I brushed it off, as paranoia, but she insisted. "Better safe than sorry," she texted. So I made a mental note to pick one up at some point. After finishing at Manny's, I sat outside on a weather-beaten bench, sipping an energy drink. My shift at the cleaning gig didn't start for another hour, so I had time to kill. The street was half busy, a lull between rush hours. A few people huddled against the cold, smoking near the curb. I spotted a reflection in the glass window of the bodega across the way. A man wearing a dark jacket, standing under a flickering street lamp, watching me from a distance. The shape of the figure matched him. Tallish, slender, hair neatly parted. My pulse pounded, but as I stood up to get a better look, a passing bus blocked my view. By the time the bus moved, he was gone. Imagining things, maybe. The brain can play tricks when you're on edge, but my body responded like I was under threat. Heart racing, sweat blooming under my armpits, every nerve crackling. I felt caged by the city's towering buildings, I forced myself to go about my night, joining the swarm of office cleaners heading to Midtown. I told myself that if I let this fear spiral, I'd never step outside again. So I vacuumed, emptied trash cans, and wiped desks, ignoring the prickle at the back of my neck. On the commute home, I tried not to look for him. If he was there, I decided to ignore him. That was the plan, at least. The train jerked forward, half empty at that hour. My eyes drifted to my reflection in the dark window, noticing how tired I looked. Smudged eyeliner, cracked lips, hair matted from the humidity. 2 stops before mine, the train paused and the doors opened. In he walked. This time, he stood at the far end, near the connecting doors. He didn't sit or read. He just held onto the metal pole, gaze occasionally flicking toward me. I pretended not to see, focusing on some ratty advertisement for a personal injury lawyer. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. A couple minutes later, we reached my station. I bolted up, power walked to the door, and stepped onto the platform. Fear twisted my stomach. I refused to glance back. If he wanted to follow me, I'd deal with it. My body trembled, but I kept going. The moment the train door slid shut, I caught a glimpse of him still standing inside. He didn't step off. I exhaled relief. Maybe I was just another paranoid city rat. Maybe he was going somewhere else entirely, living his own life, and I was making it about me. That night, sleep was elusive. My sheets were tangled with sweat, and the shadows on the wall took on strange shapes. I reminded myself it was all in my head. Then I reached for my phone to set an alarm and realized I had a missed call from unknown. No voicemail. My skin crawled at the coincidence, but I refused to dwell on it. The next morning, Manny's was short-staffed because Sasha called in sick, so I found myself covering extra hours. That meant I'd be there until late afternoon, then rush to the cleaning job. The day dragged. My feet hurt, and I was starving, because all I'd eaten was a stale pastry from the display. Around 2 p.m, an old lady in a floral scarf approached the counter, paying for cat food and black coffee. I served her, forced a smile, tried to be polite. The door chimed again behind her. My gaze flicked up, expecting some tired local. Instead, it was him. By then, I'd noticed a certain stiffness in the way he moved. Always that dark jacket, always that sense of quiet purpose. He slid inside and hovered near the aisle with cleaning supplies. That was new. Usually he went for gum or water. My pulse thundered. The old lady left, and I was alone with him. He didn't pick anything up, just lingered. My instincts told me to hide, but I had nowhere to go. This was my turf. I stepped out from behind the counter, trying to appear casual, but my voice wavered. Need help finding something? He raised his head. Those eyes zeroed in on me with an unnerving calm. I was curious if you had bleach. A bizarre question. We kept bleach, but it was behind a locked shelf because Manny's had issues with kids stealing or messing with chemicals. We do, I said, trying to keep a steady tone. I'll unlock it. I moved toward the back of the store, rummaging for the keys. He followed, footsteps soft. The overhead light buzzed, flickering. I knelt down, fiddling with the lock on the metal cabinet. My hands shook. He stood alarmingly close, the smell of a faint aftershave mixing with the stale air of the bodega. You're here a lot, he commented softly. Working 2 jobs is how you survive, I said, teeth clenched as the lock finally clicked open. Bleach is right there. I gestured to the jug. He reached over me, brushing my shoulder. Thank you, he murmured. You work too hard. Gotta pay rent, I retorted, stepping aside. My heart rattled like a trapped insect in my chest. He smiled, thin-lipped, devoid of warmth. "Yes, you do." Then he took the jug and walked toward the register. I half expected him to vanish, but no. He placed the bleach on the counter. I scanned it. $4.99, I said. He handed me a 10. I gave him change, careful not to let our fingers touch. He turned, bleach jug in hand, and strolled out. The bell chimed in his wake, leaving me alone again, shaking. I leaned against the counter, battling the rising tide of panic. Why bleach? Why the sudden interest in that? The rest of the shift I functioned on autopilot. My mind kept playing scenarios. Was he a serial killer? Some psycho who just liked messing with me? Or was I reading too much into a normal purchase? I felt like a tightly wound spring, every nerve on alert. By the time I clocked out at the bodega, I was jumpy as hell. The cleaning shift was routine, except I nearly jumped out of my skin when I bumped into one of my coworkers in a hallway. He asked if I was okay, and I lied, saying I was just tired. That night, the subway platform was emptier than usual. A faint smell of bleach lingered in my nostrils, and it churned my stomach. I noticed the flickering overhead bulb was still flickering, like a dying moth. A man's laughter drifted from somewhere else on the platform. My heart hammered, half expecting to see him around every corner. When the train rolled in, I hopped aboard, relieved to see only a few random people. The air felt thick, oppressive. We rattled through stations, doors clanging open and shut. My eyes remained glued to the window, scanning each platform for any sign of that black jacket. At some station, a group of teenage boys piled on, rowdy and loud. They shoved each other, cursing up a storm, bragging about hooking up with some girls. Their presence made me clench my jaw, not because I was prude, but because I was on edge, and they were unpredictable. The city can turn teenage bravado into a full-blown threat. One of them sat near me, the stench of stale weed rolling off his clothes. He glanced at me, opened his mouth to say something, then decided otherwise. The train lurched onward. When we pulled into my stop, I rose quickly, determined to get out. The teenage boys were still messing around as I stepped onto the platform. For a second, I breathed relief. Then the corner of my eye caught a silhouette at the opposite end. My vision blurred with panic, and I dashed for the exit. I didn't even check if it was him. My mind screamed at me to reach the street, where I could blend into the crowd. Up the steps I went, ignoring the burn in my calves, ignoring the stale piss smell that clung to the station. Once above ground, I darted onto the sidewalk. Cars rushed by, headlights glaring. Drunks outside a bar hollered at each other. The city's noise comforted me. I was just another face in the crowd, right? Yet as I turned onto my block, the sense of being pursued refused to leave. My building's front door was locked, so I fumbled with the keys, cursing under my breath. After an eternity, the door clicked open, and I stumbled inside. The hallway smelled like old paint and roach poison. But it was my safe place, in a twisted sense. No sign of him, no footsteps echoing behind me. Maybe I was safe. That weekend arrived with an unusual break in the monotony. I had Sunday off from Manny's, though I still had a night cleaning shift. I spent the morning scrubbing the apartment's bathroom, which looked like a science experiment. My roommate was still MIA. I wondered if she'd moved out permanently, but her stuff remained, gathering dust. By midday, I decided to treat myself to a walk through the neighborhood. I missed fresh air that didn't reek of subway grime. The sun was out, city traffic churning. I slipped into a hole-in-the-wall cafe, ordered the cheapest coffee, and sat outside, letting the autumn breeze calm my nerves. My phone buzzed. Dad, again. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but guilt prodded me. I answered. His voice came through, strained. "Rita, are you doing okay?" I heard from your cousin you dropped out. Why didn't you tell me?" I stared at a passing pigeon, picking at a discarded crust of bread. My jaw tightened. "Because you judge me. You always do." He sighed. "We can talk about that. But your mother would roll in her grave if she saw you tossing your future away." Anger flared. "I'm fine. I'm working. I'm paying rent. That's all I need right now. I don't want you to burn out. Come home for a while." Home wasn't an option. Home was small-town suffocation. I ended the conversation quickly, too angry to continue. My chest felt tight, but I told myself I didn't need him or anyone else telling me how to live. I spent the rest of the afternoon aimlessly wandering, drifting past thrift stores and discount clothing shops. Eventually, I remembered Katie's suggestion: pepper spray. So I popped into a small hardware store, the kind with dusty shelves stacked to the ceiling. The shopkeeper eyed me suspiciously when I asked for pepper spray, but produced a small can from behind the counter. I paid in cash, pocketed it, and hoped I wouldn't have to use it. By the time I got home, dusk settled in, painting the sky a bruised purple. I ate a quick meal of leftover noodles, changed into my cleaning uniform, and braced myself for another train ride. The thought that I was now carrying pepper spray gave me a sliver of confidence, like I had some semblance of control. The cleaning job sent me to a high-end financial firm that night. The place was empty except for security guards who barely acknowledged my existence. I vacuumed plush carpets and wiped glass walls. In a corner office, city lights glowed through, the floor-to-ceiling window, revealing the black sea of buildings beyond. I felt exposed up there, as if anyone could watch me from another skyscraper. I moved quickly, finishing each task with mechanical precision. My phone sat in my pocket, set to vibrate. Whenever it buzzed, I tensed up, half expecting some unknown number again. Mid-shift, I decided to grab coffee from the break room. Inside, a big screen TV looped financial news. I poured cheap coffee into a styrofoam cup, ignoring the pang in my stomach that demanded real food. Then I headed back to the elevator to move to the next floor. When the doors slid open, my heart lurched. There stood a figure that might have been him. The overhead light was dim, but the silhouette matched his build. My brain fired on all cylinders, screaming no. But when I stepped closer, I realized it was just the security guard, a balding guy named Tom. Relief washed over me so powerfully that I almost laughed, though tears prickled in my eyes. Tom nodded at me, stepping out. "All good?" "Yeah, just jumpy," I admitted. He shrugged and kept walking. I entered the elevator, pressed the button for the next floor, and forced myself to breathe. Paranoia was corrosive, nibbling at my sanity. Every shadow in the hallway, every footstep behind me, every reflection in a glass door became a potential threat. I knew I had to do something, confront him, or maybe talk to the police. But what would I say? Some dude on my train keeps looking at me weird and bought bleach at my bodega. They'd laugh me out of the station, so I pushed through the shift, the same as always. And near midnight, I found myself descending into the subway again, hands trembling around the pepper spray can in my coat pocket. The station was near empty. A gust of stale wind blew along the tiled corridor, carrying the faint stench of urine and damp newspaper. My footsteps echoed. I stood on the platform, arms crossed, scanning for him. Nobody. Just a bored MTA worker. On the far side, leaning against a wall, looking at his phone. The train rumbled in, squealing to a halt. Doors opened with a wheeze. I stepped on and found a seat in a relatively empty car. A woman a few seats away typed furiously on her laptop. A bearded man dozed with his head drooping forward. I settled in, exhaling relief. Maybe I'd imagined the worst. 2 stops later, the train hissed open, and more passengers trickled in. My attention drifted to the dingy overhead ads again. Injury lawyers, plastic surgeons, cheap phone plans, the city's colorful mosaic of exploitation. A wave of exhaustion swept over me, lulled by the train's rocking motion. At some point, I shut my eyes, not fully asleep, just dozing. Then a shift in the atmosphere jolted me upright. My eyes snapped, open. Standing by the doors at the far end was Harold. Though I hadn't yet learned his name was Harold, I just recognized the face, that unwavering gaze. He wasn't reading this time. He stared directly at me. My pulse slammed into overdrive. I slid my hand into my coat pocket, gripping the pepper spray. If he approached, I'd be ready. Station after station, he remained where he was, the tension stretched like a taut string, on the verge of snapping. I forced myself to maintain eye contact, to show I wasn't scared, though I was shaking inside. When we neared my stop, I prepared to bolt. The second the doors opened, I rose and hurried out onto the platform. A brief glance back revealed him still standing in the train, expression unreadable. As the doors shut, I saw him raise his hand as though to wave. Then the train pulled away. I couldn't breathe for a moment, heart banging like a war drum. That wave was the final push. Enough was enough. I decided I'd approach the NYPD the next day, or at least talk to Manny or the cleaning service about security. This was crossing the line from weird coincidence to deliberate stalking. The next morning, Manny's was short-staffed again, so I found myself stuck behind the counter for a long shift. My head pounded from lack of sleep, and I didn't have the mental capacity to do anything more than ring up orders. Around noon, an older man with a thick accent came in, asking for directions. I did my best to guide him, but realized I was messing up my words. My brain just wasn't firing right. He looked confused as hell. Finally, Jorge took over, giving the man directions. Then Jorge turned to me, scowling. "You look like you're on drugs." "Screw you," I snapped, rubbing my temples. "I'm just tired." He rolled his eyes, but let it go. The day crawled by. Every time the door chimed, I jerked my head up, half expecting the dark jacket. A steady stream of customers came and went, but he didn't show. I tried to gather my courage to tell Jorge about the situation, or at least mention that some creep might be frequenting the store. But something in me hesitated. Jorge wasn't exactly the empathetic type. He'd probably make a joke about me leading the guy on. After lunch rush, I took a short break in the tiny back room that smelled like stale bread and cleaning solutions. I pulled out my phone to scroll mindlessly and almost dropped it when I saw a new text from an unknown number. "You looked tired last night." My skin went cold. The words hammered at my skull, unleashing raw panic. I typed back, "Who is this?" No answer, of course. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, trying to interpret the meaning. It was him, obviously. He'd found my number somehow, and he wanted me to know he was watching me. I felt cornered. The walls of the back room seemed to close in. My heart pounded in my ears. I wanted to cry, or punch something, or both, but I had to pull myself together. My break was almost up. When I returned to the counter, I plastered on a fake smile. A teenage girl asked for cigarettes, and I told her to get lost. A middle-aged guy bought a lottery ticket. The normal flow of bodega bullshit kept me moving, but my mind screamed in the background. I considered calling Katie or my dad, but what would they do? I had no proof this guy was actually dangerous, only that he was crossing boundary after boundary. The city's brimming with creeps, and the cops rarely care unless there's physical harm. Still, I promised myself I'd talk to the NYPD soon. Enough illusions of safety. That evening, I trudged to the cleaning job, or at least I tried. Halfway there, my phone rang with a local number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, but picked up. A voice on the other end. Male, calm. "You should go home. Stop working so hard." Fear. jolted through me. "Who the fuck is this?" I demanded, heart throbbing. The line went dead. A busy tone followed. I stared at my phone like it had grown fangs. I immediately called back but got a generic voicemail. Part of me wanted to run to the police station right then, but the other part still worried they'd brush me off. I continued to the cleaning job, mind racing. By the time I arrived, the supervisor told me I'd be working solo tonight. Anisha was out sick. Awesome. Another lonely shift in a half-empty building. I was on edge the entire time, jumping at every small sound, gripping my phone like a lifeline. Mid-shift, I stood by a massive window overlooking the city. A storm gathered in the sky, dark clouds swirling. It was one of those nights where the city glistened with a sinister glow, the pavement reflecting neon lights. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. I pressed my forehead against the glass, feeling the cold seep in. My reflection looked haunted, eyes ringed with fatigue. I considered the new text and phone call. He was pushing me, trying to break me. If that was his goal, it was working. I forced myself to move, to not get lost in my own reflection. The hours crawled, and eventually, I finished. As I headed to the subway, the storm finally unleashed, rain hammering the streets. A few hardy souls trudged through with umbrellas. I dashed down the stairs to the station, water dripping from my hair. Platform nearly empty again. Rainwater seeped onto the tiles, forming shallow puddles. The overhead lights buzzed, half of them flickering. I kept one hand on the pepper spray in my coat pocket, scanning every corner. The train arrived. I stepped on, found a seat, and exhaled in relief. About 4 stops in, my sense of safety crumbled. He entered the car from the next door over, spotted me, and sat a few rows away. The brightness in his eyes burned a path directly into my panic. I could almost see him smirking. The train rattled on, ignoring my internal meltdown. I got up, determined to move to another car. I didn't care if it looked crazy. As I stood, the train jerked, and a screech tore through the air. We ground to an unexpected stop in the middle of the tunnel. The lights flickered off, plunging the car into near darkness. A collective groan rose from the passengers, quickly edged by nervous chatter. Emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in a sickly, faint glow. I scanned for him. He was no longer in his seat. My heart hammered. The conductor's garbled voice announced some technical failure, telling us to remain calm. Some people switched on their phone flashlights. Adrenaline spiked in my veins. I gripped the pepper spray, pivoting my head in every direction, expecting him to lunge from the shadows. Minutes dragged. The air in the car grew stifling. An older woman near the front complained she couldn't breathe. A man cursed the MTA. I barely heard them. My entire focus was on staying alert. Where did he go? A figure moved between the seats, creeping closer. My chest seized. Then a beam from a phone flashlight revealed it was just the older woman's son trying to help her. My mind played constant worst-case scenarios. Then, out of nowhere, his voice, calm and quiet, came from behind me. "You look terrified." I spun around. He stood close, too close, eyes reflecting the faint glow. My stomach twisted with fear, but I refused to cower. I lifted the pepper spray, brandishing it at him. "Back off!" I snapped. He stared, unflinching. An unsettling stillness radiated from him. "Calm down," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you." "Fuck that," I hissed. "You've been following me, texting me, calling me. You think that's normal?" He opened his mouth to respond, but the train suddenly lurched to life, lights flickering back on. The moment's hush shattered as the conductor announced we'd be moving again. Passengers scrambled to find seats, sighing with relief. My eyes flicked around in confusion. Where had he gone? A swirl of movement around me. And by the time I looked back, he was gone, like a ghost swallowed by the crowd. The train resumed its journey, pulling into the next station. I bolted off the second the doors slid open, weaving through the platform, bounding up the steps 2 at a time. The rain had subsided to a drizzle, but I barely noticed. I sprinted home, breath ragged, anger and fear warring in my chest. The next day, I dragged myself to Manny's, body sore, mind buzzing. Sleep had been impossible. My reflection in the bodega's security mirror looked ghostly. Jorge was in a foul mood, yelling at deliveries for being late. I cornered him when the store was empty. "Hey, quick question," I started, voice unsteady. "That middle-aged guy in a black jacket, he's come in a few times, right? Do you remember him?" Jorge shrugged. "We get 100 people a day, half of them in black jackets." I pressed on, trembling. "He buys gum, or water, or coffee. Recently bought bleach. He's quiet, maybe around 50. He might have. Told you his name?" Jorge gave me a weird look, but then sighed, checking the computer screen. "A while back, a guy asked me about store hours, said he works at night. I think he mentioned his name. I wrote it down for the membership card, but we never had him fill it out." He clicked a few things, scanning the monitor. "Harold something, didn't catch a last name. Why do you care?" My stomach churned. So that was it. Harold. The name felt sinister on my tongue, like it was mocking me. "He's bothering me." Jorge's brows knitted. "Listen, if he's threatening you, you should talk to the cops. But that's none of my business." Typical Jorge, dismissing me like I was an inconvenience. Still, I had a name now. That gave me a sliver of something tangible. Harold. Maybe I could do a Google search, see if anything turned up. The city's full of people with that name, but I'd try. The rest of the shift, I kept checking the door, half expecting Harold to stroll in, smirking, but he never showed. When the time came to go clean offices, I was torn. Should I skip it, head to the police station instead, or do my job? I needed the money. So I went. In the office building that night, I found an empty conference room and locked myself inside for a moment. I pulled out my phone, typed Harold NYC into a search engine. Predictably, too many results. I tried narrowing it down, adding words like subway, stalker, bleach, nothing relevant, just random news articles and websites. My frustration peaked. Harold was a needle in a haystack. I cursed under my breath. Maybe the cops could help, but I still worried they'd brush me off. Also, there was a question gnawing at me. If Harold was so intent on messing with me, why keep it so subtle? Why not do something outright violent? That line of thought was twisted. I was basically waiting for him to hurt me so I could have proof. The entire system is fucked, isn't it? You can't get help until something truly horrible happens, and by then, it's too late. Sighing, I shoved my phone away. I finished cleaning, fighting off the sense that every little noise in the corridor might be him sneaking closer. My body was a coiled spring again. Anxiety sweat dotted my forehead. Just before midnight, I left, heading to the subway. As I descended the steps, a wave of loathing for that place hit me. The city invests millions in skyscrapers, but the underground feels like an abandoned realm of flickering lights and rats. Or maybe it's just me who sees it that way now. I got on the train, choosing a car with a few people in it, safety in numbers. A young couple snuggled in the corner, a man in a hoodie scrolled on his phone, and 2 older women chatted in Spanish. No sign of Harold. My tension eased. Perhaps he'd had his fill. A few stops in, I noticed movement outside the subway window as we pulled away from a station. A figure in a black jacket stood on the platform, watching the train depart. I glimpsed that face for a split second, the same unblinking stare, Harold hadn't boarded. He'd just stood there, letting the train leave. A shiver tore through my body. He was toying with me, letting me see him, letting me know he was still out there, but not giving me the chance to confront him. Like a cat with a mouse, or a puppeteer, yanking the strings. At home, I locked my door, wedged a chair under the knob like they do in movies. My roommate's bed remained vacant. I found myself wishing she was around, if only for the comfort of another person. The night passed in a haze of nightmares, where subway tunnels stretched infinitely, and a figure in black loomed at every turn. Morning came too soon. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. Manny's was busier than usual, so I had no time to think. But once the rush died, I told Jorge I had a family emergency and needed to leave a bit early. He scoffed but didn't argue. So around noon, I found myself at a police precinct near the bodega, mustering the nerve to go inside. The waiting area had that stale institutional smell, old plastic chairs lined up against dirty walls. A board officer at the front desk asked my name and reason for visiting. I stammered out something about being followed, harassed. He raised an eyebrow, handed me a form, and told me to wait. Wait I did, for nearly an hour. Eventually, a female officer called me into a small room with fluorescent lights that made my headache spike. She was polite enough, took my statement, but her tone was skeptical when I explained the series of events. The repeated subway encounters, the bleach purchase, the phone calls, the unknown texts. She jotted notes. So you say his name is Harold, but you have no last name, no address, and no direct threats? I nodded, frustration churning in my gut. Look, it's not normal. He's stalking me, I swear. She sighed, flipping through the form. We can file a complaint. Without a clear threat or physical assault, it's tough to classify this as more than suspicious behavior. We'll keep it on record. If he tries something more concrete, call 911 immediately. Anger burned behind my eyes. So that's it? You're not even going to check cameras on the subway or something? She offered a sympathetic shrug. We get hundreds of these complaints, Ms. Rita. The city is huge. Without more evidence, we can't do much. If you see him again, try to record or take a photo. That might help us build a case. I left the station feeling defeated, clutching a paper with a complaint number that felt meaningless. Harold had outmaneuvered me at every turn, leaving no tangible proof. I cursed the system, cursed the city, cursed Manny for paying me peanuts so I couldn't move somewhere else. I trudged through the rest of the day at Manny's, seething. By the time I headed to the cleaning job, a dull anger had replaced my fear. If Harold showed up, I'd pepper spray him and get that proof the cops wanted. Let them ignore me after that. At the office building, I changed into a cleaner's jumpsuit, pinned my hair up, and started the usual tasks. Anisha was back, cheerful as ever, which grated on my nerves. She hummed pop songs while vacuuming. I appreciated her presence, but also envied her obliviousness. Around 10:30, I took the trash out to the loading dock behind the building. A narrow alley stretched behind it, piled with discarded pallets and reeking of rotting food. I wore gloves, so the stench was more bearable. I tossed the trash bag into the dumpster, wincing at the squelch. That's when a small clink caught my attention. Something metal slid off the top of the dumpster and fell at my feet. Curious, I crouched to pick it up, half expecting a random piece of scrap, but my breath hitched the moment I realized what I was holding. A simple silver bracelet. I recognized. It was the same bracelet I'd left on my bedside table a few nights ago. A cheap piece of jewelry my mom gave me when I was 16. How the hell did it end up behind this building? Panic strangled my lungs. Did Harold sneak into my apartment? Was my roommate involved? The thought of him rummaging through my possessions made me nauseous. I stared at the dull silver links, my pulse roaring. A wave of rage and dread overwhelmed me. I stuffed the bracelet into my pocket and fled back inside, nearly colliding with Anisha in the hallway. She saw my expression and frowned. "Everything okay?" I couldn't form a coherent sentence. Just not feeling well," I lied. She offered a comforting pat on the shoulder, but I jerked away. My mind reeled with a single question. If he could break into my place and leave that bracelet in the dumpster, what else could he do? The rest of the shift was pure torture. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the vacuum. I tried texting Katie, but she was busy or asleep. No response. I considered calling the police right there. But what would I say? He left my stolen bracelet in a dumpster behind my workplace. They'd probably ask if I had proof it was actually stolen, or if I dropped it. Another dead end. So I powered through the shift, swallowing my fear. By the time midnight rolled around, I felt like I was on the verge of a breakdown. Nevertheless, the subway was my only way home. I cursed the city for not having a better transport option. The station was emptier than usual. A single flickering light cast a dingy glow on the platform. I gripped the pepper spray and paced, refusing to sit. The train eventually arrived, doors opening with a forlorn screech. Inside, the car was nearly deserted. Two men in suits argued loudly near one door, reeking of whiskey. I found a seat far from them, near the center. The train jolted forward. My reflection in the window looked pale, eyes wide. 3 stops later, one of the drunk men bumped into the other, and a shouting match ensued. They shoved each other, cursing. My nerves were already frayed, and the sudden violence made me jolt. The train hissed to a halt at the next station, and they stumbled off, still shouting. That left me alone with a scattered handful of people, none of whom were paying attention to me. I scanned the car. Harold wasn't there. Relief mingled with dread, because he could appear at any moment. The next few stops passed quietly. By the time we reached my station, my legs felt wobbly. I stepped off, bracing myself for a possible ambush. The platform was empty, except for a row of flickering fluorescent lights overhead. I walked slowly, every muscle tensed. The corridor leading to the exit felt longer than usual. My footsteps echoed on the tile. The only other figure was an MTA worker mopping in the distance, ignoring me. That's when the lights abruptly went out, plunging the corridor into darkness. Heart stuttered. The blackness was absolute for a few seconds, until an emergency light flickered on, casting harsh shadows. I reached into my pocket, gripping the pepper spray so tightly my fingers hurt. A shuffle sounded behind me, and I spun around, adrenaline spiking. No one there. I forced myself to move, hurrying toward the exit. Another footstep, this time closer. I whipped around again, pepper spray raised. Still nobody. My lungs tightened. The door to the street was 20 feet away. I sprinted for it, ignoring my screaming calves, reached the door and shoved it open. The night air tasted like freedom. Outside, cars whooshed by. A couple argued, on the sidewalk. Streetlights glowed overhead. I let out a trembling breath, stuffing the pepper spray back in my pocket. Maybe it was just the damn MTA lights failing again. Or maybe it was him, toying with me. I had no proof either way. When I finally locked myself in my apartment, I felt like collapsing. The chair was still wedged under the doorknob. I checked my room. Everything seemed untouched. My roommate's side was still deserted. The only sign someone had been there was the faint smell of my own sweat. I rummaged through my drawers, ensuring nothing else was missing, but couldn't focus. Exhaustion dragged me down, eventually lulling me into a fitful sleep filled with twisted images of dark corridors and an unseen figure breathing down my neck. I woke up late the next morning, my phone alarm blaring at me. A wave of dread hit the moment I opened my eyes, remembering the bracelet, the darkness in the subway, the unstoppable sense of being hunted. but I had to function. Manny's awaited, along with the cleaning job. I was a hamster back on the wheel. Around noon, the bell at Manny's announced a customer. I glanced up and felt my insides seize. Harold stood at the entrance, holding the door half open, as if gauging whether to step inside. Our eyes locked. Time froze. My chest constricted. Then, slowly, he let the door close behind him. He approached the counter, ignoring my terrified stare. My knees threatened to buckle. I snatched my phone from under the counter, turning the camera on. He saw it and paused. "Harold, right?" I forced out, voice shaking. "Stay the hell away from me." He cocked his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said softly. "I'm not who you think I am." Rage flared. "Bullshit. You broke into my place, took my stuff, left it in a dumpster. You've followed me for weeks, calling me, texting me from unknown numbers. You think I'm too scared to do something about it?" His lips parted, as if to refute my claims. Then that smile appeared again, so unnervingly calm. "You're clearly upset. Why don't we talk outside?" A wave of panic gripped me. Jorge was in the back, out of earshot, and Manny's had no other customers at that moment. Harold's presence loomed like a black cloud. I stepped back, raising my phone to snap a photo. He shielded his face with a quick movement, pivoted, and strode toward the door. Before exiting, he turned, eyes meeting mine with a piercing intensity. "You'll regret involving other people," he said. Then he walked out. I stood there, phone in hand, heart hammering. I'd captured only a partial shot of him raising his arm, no clear face. My attempt at a photo was useless. A tremor coursed through me as I realized he'd threatened me. Maybe not explicitly, but enough to fill my veins with ice. I stumbled. To the back, found Jorge rummaging in the storage room. "There's a man. Harold. He threatened me," I stammered. "He just left." Jorge frowned, glancing at me. "He threatened you how?" I repeated the exchange, voice trembling. Jorge scratched his chin. "Okay, we got cameras, right? Maybe we caught it on camera this time. Let me check." My heart lifted at the possibility of real evidence. Maybe, finally, I'd have something to hand to the cops. But Manny's security system was a dinosaur. When Jorge replayed the footage, all we got was a grainy feed where Harold's face looked like a blurry smudge. The audio was shit, so we couldn't pick up his words. Jorge cursed the outdated system. I felt tears of frustration prick my eyes. "Go home, Rita," Jorge said finally, seeing my state. "You're in no condition to work right now. I'll cover the rest of your shift." I should have been grateful for the reprieve, but dread filled me at the thought of walking outside alone. Still, I couldn't stay in Manny's forever. I left through the front door, scanning the street for any sign of Harold. Nothing. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. I hurried home, every nerve frayed, constantly checking over my shoulder. Once locked inside, I tried calling Katie. Straight to voicemail. "Dad?" I hesitated, then dialed. He picked up, sounding tired. I told him in halting words that someone was stalking me, that I was scared for my life. His tone shifted to alarm, asking if he should come. I told him I'd handle it. After I hung up, I dialed the police again, gave them the complaint number, said the guy had threatened me in person at Manny's. They said they'd note the escalation, but without more concrete evidence or an actual assault, they couldn't do much. They advised me again to gather any photos, texts, or records of calls. My fury boiled over. The system was worthless. I decided to skip the cleaning shift that night. Screw the money for once. I needed to reevaluate, or at least calm my nerves before I lost my mind. I texted the cleaning supervisor, faking a sickness. Then I curled up on the couch with a stiff, "Drink, whiskey, courtesy of my absentee roommate, and tried to plan a strategy. Maybe I should leave the city. But where would I go? My dad's place? That would be an admission of defeat. Plus, I'd have no job there, no money, and Harold might still find me eventually. Or maybe I could switch apartments. But with my current financial state, that was near impossible. Another part of me felt a simmering rage. Why should I be the one to uproot my life because this asshole decided I was his target? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. The whiskey helped. I decided I'd take the fight to him in a sense. Draw him out, record him, get indisputable proof. Sure, it was risky, but living in fear was destroying me. Late that night, I hovered by my apartment window, listening to the city's distant roar. My phone buzzed once more with a text from an unknown number. You can't hide forever. My blood ran hot. Instead of fear, I felt a furious determination. Fuck you, I texted back, no response. The following morning, I called Manny's and told them I needed a day off. Jorge was pissed, but I barely heard him. My plan was to skip both jobs and instead go to places where I knew Harold might lurk. The subway routes, Manny's, the bodegas, vicinity. I'd keep my phone camera ready. If he approached or threatened me again, I'd capture it. Dangerous? Absolutely. But I was done cowering. I spent the afternoon preparing, making sure my phone was fully charged, carrying a battery, pack, and keeping the pepper spray on me. A gust of wind rattled the windows, hinting at another storm. Seemed fitting for the showdown I wanted. By early evening, I stationed myself near Manny's, leaning against a lamppost, trying to blend in with the usual foot traffic. People bustled past, heads down, phones out. A normal city scene. My heart thumped like a drum in my chest. Would Harold show? An hour passed. 2. Nothing. My back ached from standing. My eyes scanned every black jacket. Then, around dusk, I glimpsed a figure crossing the street, heading straight for Manny's. It was, him, posture rigid, face set in a grim expression. Adrenaline surged, but I forced myself to remain still. He opened the bodega door, stepped inside. I slipped across the street, phone at the ready. Through the window, I watched him approach the counter. I couldn't see who was working. Maybe Sasha or someone else. My hand shook. He paid for something, then turned to leave. Before he reached the door, I burst inside, phone raised. "Smile, motherfucker," I spat, voice shaky with anger. The bodega's clerk, a random co-worker I barely knew, looked startled. Harold froze, coffee cup in hand, gaze locking with mine. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. "Am I?" I moved closer, phone camera aimed. "Show the world. Your face. Maybe the cops will finally do something." A flicker of annoyance crossed his features. Then he turned, trying to shield himself. But I followed. My heart hammered, a savage thrill fueling me. That's when he lashed out, grabbing my wrist. The phone nearly slipped from my grip, but I clung to it. "You don't want to do this," he hissed, voice low. "I've been patient with you." "Patient?" I echoed, yanking free. The clerk yelled at us to take it outside, but everything else faded into the background. I backed away toward the door, still filming. "You've been stalking me, you twisted piece of shit." His eyes narrowed. Without warning, he lunged, knocking the phone from my hand. It clattered to the floor. A momentary struggle ensued. My rage flared, and I shoved him back, smashing an elbow into his chest. The clerk yelled for security or threatened to call the cops. My ears rang with the chaos. Harold stumbled but didn't fall. I scooped up my phone, adrenaline blazing. The clerk was behind the counter, frantically dialing something. Harold shot me a venomous glare, then sprinted out. I followed, phone camera rolling, but he vanished into the crowd outside, weaving through people like a phantom. My breath came in ragged gasps. For a moment, I stood on the sidewalk, disoriented by the swirl of bodies. A few passers-by stared at me. Then I noticed the coffee cup Harold had dropped near the curb, spilling its contents onto the pavement. I didn't get a clean shot of his face, just a chaotic blur of movement. But maybe it was enough to prove he'd assaulted me. I clung to that shred of hope, trembling. Feeling both victorious and terrified, I called the cops once more, telling them I had video evidence of him physically assaulting me in Manny's. They directed me to come to the precinct. I hopped on the subway, phone gripped tight. My heart wouldn't slow. Halfway to the precinct, I noticed my phone battery was draining fast, probably from all the filming. I rummaged for the charger, cursing when I realized I'd forgotten the cable at home in my rush. The train lurched. Doors slid open at the next stop, letting a wave of passengers in. I found myself pushed to a corner, a crowd pressing around me. Claustrophobic heat coiled in my chest. I tried to maneuver toward the door, to exit and wait for the next train, but the surge of bodies was relentless. That's when I saw him on the platform, just as the doors were about to close. Harold. He stared right at me, eyes cold. My pulse skyrocketed. I slammed the door open button, but it was too late. The doors sealed with a hiss and the train pulled away. He remained on the platform, shrinking from view, a stoic statue. The next station arrived. I elbowed through the crowd, stumbling out onto the platform. I needed to transfer trains to head to the precinct. My phone beeped low battery warnings. Anxiety spiked. Without that video, I had nothing. Determined, I moved quickly, found the right platform, and waited. The lights overhead felt harsher than usual. My reflection in the metal walls looked feral. A feeling of unease prickled my skin. He could catch the next train and find me. The city was vast, but he always seemed to know where I was. The train arrived. I boarded, scanning each face for Harold. Not there. Relief, tinged with dread. A couple stops later, I hopped off near the precinct, phone at 10% battery. I rushed up the stairs into the night air, found the station. Inside, I flagged an officer, panting out my story, showing him the shaky footage. He nodded, ushered me into a back room. A plainclothes detective joined us after a while, reviewing the clip. It was hard to see Harold's face clearly, but the detective said it might be enough for a more thorough investigation. They kept me for hours, asking questions, typing up notes. My phone battery died during the process. At last, near midnight, they told me they'd do what they could and suggested I find a safe place to stay. They advised me to not go home alone or to arrange for someone to be with me. I asked if I could stay at the precinct. They only offered vague reassurance. Outside, the city's night air felt colder than usual. I had no one else to call, no place to crash. Katie was out of town, ironically, for a music festival. My father lived states away. The cops had done their best, but that didn't guarantee Harold wouldn't strike again. I decided to risk going home. The idea of him lurking in my building made my insides churn, but I had no other option. My phone was dead, so I couldn't call for a cab. The subway or walking were my only choices. Both felt dangerous, but I opted for the subway, ironically. It was faster, and I was too exhausted to walk the miles home. The station was nearly deserted, just a homeless man curled up on a bench, a bored MTA staffer in a booth reading a newspaper. I trudged down the steps, noticing a few overhead lights were out, plunging patches of the platform into darkness. A train thundered in. I boarded the second car from the front, choosing a seat near the door. My reflection hovered in the window, a pale face with hollow eyes. I hugged my bag, feeling the pepper spray can pressing against my side. If Harold tried anything, I'd be ready. We rattled through station after station, the car mostly empty. I glimpsed a small group of drunk bar-goers in the adjacent car. stumbling and laughing. Part of me wanted to join them just for safety in numbers, but I stayed put. Then, somewhere between stations, the train slowed to an unexpected stop. My breath caught. Not again, I thought, dread seizing me. The lights flickered but didn't go out completely. The conductor's announcement was garbled. Something about a signal malfunction. I waited, pulse pounding. The wait stretched. The drunk group from the next car stumbled through the connecting doors, wanting to see what was happening. Their laughter echoed in the stagnant air. I decided to do the opposite. Slip into the adjacent car behind me, hoping to avoid them. So I entered the narrow passageway, opened the door carefully, and stepped into the next car. Dim overhead lights revealed a single figure seated in the corner. Harold. My stomach twisted violently. Our eyes locked. The train's hum filled the silence, underscored by the distant laughter of the drunk group. No immediate escape. The door behind me slid shut, sealing me in with him. He didn't move, just stared. I forced my trembling hand into my pocket, wrapping my fingers around the pepper spray. "Stay back," I snarled, mustering a flicker of defiance. He rose slowly, that same eerie calm. "I never wanted this to be so dramatic," he murmured. Rage collided with terror inside me. "You broke into my place, stole my things, threatened me. What the hell do you want?" His lips parted in a small sigh. "I've been tasked with watching you." My mind reeled. Tasked by who? He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Let's just say you're the subject of some interest, and I was instructed to observe." He stepped closer, and I whipped out the pepper spray. The train jerked again, but still didn't move. Metal wheels squealed. "That's insane," I spat. "Stay the fuck away from me." An odd flicker passed over his face. For the first time, he looked uncertain, maybe a hint of regret. Then he lunged, trying to knock the pepper spray from my hand. Reflex kicked in. I sprayed him directly, a burst of chemical fury. He recoiled, cursing. I dashed past him, heart pounding. He grabbed my wrist, nails biting into my skin. I screamed, feeling a primal surge of adrenaline. Twisting around, I swung, my elbow into his jaw. A jolt of pain shot up my arm. He stumbled back, eyes watering, face contorted. Another blast of pepper spray, and he loosened his grip. Panic fueled me. I yanked the door open to retreat into the next car, nearly tripping over my own feet. The drunk group saw my wild eyes and scattered, uncertain what was happening. Harold staggered behind me, coughing, half-blinded. Some primal part of me took over, needing to finish this. I grabbed one of the emergency handles on the wall, brandishing it like a weapon. "You want more?" I snarled, voice ragged. He held up a hand as if to surrender, tears streaming from his inflamed eyes. A guttural rasp escaped his throat. The train jerked again, lights flickering. Then, with a screech, we started moving. Relief and dread collided. We rolled into the next station, doors sliding open. The drunk group bolted out, yelling. A few straggling passengers stared, alarmed. I stumbled after them, scanning for an MTA official or a cop. Harold half collapsed against the seats, hacking. My mind burned with the urge to see him arrested, but survival instincts told me to run. I tore through the station, ignoring curious. Stairs. Up the stairs, onto the street, lungs heaving. Night enveloped me, a swirl of neon and passing car headlights. Footsteps thundered behind me. I spun around, ready to fight, but it was just a random passerby giving me a startled look. Harold was nowhere in sight. My entire body trembled, adrenaline pumping. I staggered a few blocks, finally slowing near an all-night diner. I collapsed onto a bench outside, head in my hands, trying to catch my breath. In the reflection of the diner's window, I saw my wild eyes, disheveled hair, and tear-streaked cheeks. I looked like a cornered animal. What had he meant about being tasked to watch me? Was it some conspiracy or a twisted game? I might never know. Part of me didn't care anymore. I just wanted him gone. Pepper spraying him felt like a hollow victory. He could come back at any time. Maybe he'd vanish. Or maybe the police, with that new footage, would finally track him down. I stared at the flickering neon sign of the diner, feeling the city's pulse in my veins. The block smelled of fried grease and car exhaust. Sirens wailed somewhere far off. The night was cold enough that my breath hung in the air. An old man rummaged through a nearby trash can, coughing into the darkness. In that moment, I realized the city wouldn't change for me. It devours the weak and churns out more ghosts. But I wasn't about to let it consume me entirely. Maybe I'd move eventually, or maybe I'd stay. But I swore to myself I wouldn't let fear rule every step. As I sat there on the bench, caught between wanting to flee and wanting to stand my ground, I felt an odd sense of poetic melancholy. The city loomed like a monstrous entity, bright and relentless, while I was just one battered soul among millions. I wanted to cry for all the dreams that had led me here, and for all the nightmares that threatened to drive me away. Eventually, I forced myself up, found a payphone, rare as dinosaurs in this city, and called the precinct again, gave them a choked summary of what happened. They said they'd send someone to the station, but by then, Harold was long gone. Another empty promise of an investigation. I caught a cab, sparing what little money I had left, and headed home. My building looked the same, indifferent to my turmoil. I climbed the stairs, each step echoing with the weight of the past few weeks. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door, slid down to the floor, and let out a trembling breath. No sign he'd been there. My roommate's bed still undisturbed. I pulled out my phone charger and plugged it in, letting my phone power up. A flurry of messages and missed calls from the cops, from Manny's, from Dad. None from Harold. Maybe the pepper spray had at least bought me some peace. I stayed up until dawn, curled on the couch, waiting for a knock that never came. The city outside carried on, taxis rumbling, night workers trudging home. At some point I dozed off, nightmares swirling with images of Harold's eyes in the dimly lit subway car. But whenever I jolted awake, I remembered the final confrontation. I'd fought back for once. Maybe I'd never know his motives. Maybe he was just a twisted motherfucker who latched onto me because I looked vulnerable. Or maybe there was a darker scheme. No matter the reason, I had proof of his attack now. And the cops had to take me seriously. I clung to that thought like a raft in a stormy sea. Days later, Manny's security tapes and my shaky phone footage were handed to the police. They said it might help them identify Harold, track him down. I haven't heard any updates. The city's labyrinth of crimes doesn't prioritize a single maniac unless he leaves a body in his wake. Life goes on. I still ride the subway, though I keep a knife in my bag alongside the pepper spray. I don't see him anymore. Every so often I'll catch a glimpse of someone in a black jacket, and my heart will lurch. Then they'll turn around, and it's just a stranger. The dread lingers, though, like a bruise that won't heal. There's a quiet sadness in me now, an awareness that the city's illusions of safety were always tissue-thin. I still have nightmares about the tunnel going dark, his voice whispering behind me. Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating in those nightmares, but I wake up, remind myself I survived. Maybe that's the only closure I'll ever get. I'll tell you this, friend. Be careful in those lonely subway cars. Watch whose eyes linger on you a second too long. Don't dismiss that tension as simple paranoia. The city might have millions of faces, but it only takes one to turn your life into a goddamn horror show. And if you ever sense that creeping dread, never ignore it. Fight back, even if it feels hopeless. Because sometimes, that's all we've got. If you're asking whether I believe he's still out there, maybe planning another round of torment, I don't know. The city is vast. People slip in and out like ghosts. But I'm not the same woman I was. Next time, if there is a next time, I won't wait for him to pounce. I'll do what I must. No more nightmares controlling me. That's how it went down. In the tunnels of this place, the city that chews us up and spits out the bones. I keep reminding myself I'm still standing. Battered, sure, but alive. Maybe that's enough. I hope you never find yourself on the receiving end of a gaze like Harold's. But if you do, remember what I said. Hold your ground, even if your knees shake. Because in this neon graveyard of broken dreams, sometimes a shaky stand is the only thing that keeps the monsters at bay.